Chapter 1923 Dwindling Hope. Just die, damn you! Rain staggered back, supporting the blade of her tachi with a hand to block a descending stinger. Its speed was so great that she had barely managed to react in time, and its force was so terrible that she was thrown back a dozen meters. Her arms felt numb. When fighting nightmare creatures of a superior rank, blocking was really not a good idea. But the damn thing was so fast that there was simply no time for her to move out of the way. Luckily, she had done her job. A split second after Rain was tossed back, Elamar's Zweihander plummeted on the tail of the abomination, striking precisely at the spot where its armor had already been broken. The severed stinger fell to the ground in a flood of fetid blood, and the monstrous creature turned threateningly toward the young centurion, its claws flying forward at lightning speed. Tamar had no time to disengage and dash to the side. She simply stepped on air and leaped over the claws, then did so again. This time, the invisible platform seemed to be situated perpendicular to the ground, so he threw her body sideways instead of up, twisting and landing in a slide. The nightmare creature was already lunging at her, but at that moment, Ray, whom it had not noticed, blinded by pain, jumped onto its carapace and drove his sword through its eye. The abomination convulsed and fell, moving weakly. It was still alive, but completely dazed. The three awakened rushed forward and unleashed a barrage of attacks, eventually finishing it off. All three were breathing heavily, barely enduring their exhaustion, and that was despite the occasional infusion of stamina from Fleur. The rest of the soldiers were faring even worse. Rain shivered, noticing that another nightmare creature was already barreling in their direction. Just how many? The ground was already littered with so many corpses that it was hard to see the scarlet moss beneath. They couldn't go on much longer. Luckily, at that moment, the familiar, reassuring voice of the Blood Sister reached them like the most beautiful melody in the world. 7th Legion! Retreat! Allaire turn on the front line was over, this turn, at least. The Legion retreated in an orderly manner, and at the same time, another brigade advanced between their ranks. Soon, their backs hid the battlefield from Rain's view, and she let out a relieved sigh. Moving back almost all the way to the edge of the water, the 7th Legion came to a halt. Elhi's soldiers fell to the ground where they stood, shocked, exhausted, and covered in blood. Some dismissed their armor despite the dire danger. The heat was just too unbearable, and they were all drowning in sweat. Everyone was dehydrated, so the first thing many did was greedily drink water from their canteens. Rain was no exception. After drinking her share, she finally felt alive again. While Fleur was tending to their wounds, all minor, fortunately, and infusing them with refreshing vitality, the three members of the cohort who had actively participated in the melee remained silent. Honestly, they were too stunned by the magnitude and ferocity of the violence, too dazed, and too tired to talk. Even Tamar, who had been programmed to always maintain composure by her clan, seemed subdued and shaken. None of them had died yet, at least. The same could not be said about most other cohorts. The number of slain nightmare creatures was incalculable, but the casualties suffered by the Song army were also heavy. It is not a last stand. Rain knew that it wasn't, but it seemed like one more and more with each passing minute. The 7th Legion had fought well during their first rotation, and during the second, too. However, during the third, the tired soldiers started to make more and more mistakes. As a result, more and more of them died. They had just finished the 5th rotation, and the situation was starting to look bleak, not just for them, but for the entire army. The warriors of Song were desperate, exhausted, and slowly succumbing to fear. Their morale had especially plummeted when one of the saints, the one whose transformation resembled a horned lion with a venomous viper for the tail, finally fell, debilitated by countless wounds, and was immediately swallowed by the tide of nightmare creatures. Like that, the Song army lost its first transcendent champion. Watching a saint die was a shock to everyone, not only because they were watching the death of a living legend, but also because it forced the soldiers to ask themselves a simple question: if even demigods were dying, then what hope did mere mortals like them have? Rain threw a glance at her shadow, drawing strength from it, then turned to the flooded clearing and stared into the distance with a detached expression. The battle had been unbearably hard on the army, lasting an eternity. She couldn't imagine how Lady Sishan and her team could still be alive while fighting a great demon, but they were, continuing the devastating battle. Even though it was taking place too far to discern the silhouettes of the daughters of Kisong, everyone in the second layer of the battle formation could turn around and look at the flooded plain to see the massive shape of the demon moving across the water, making it surge and boil. At some point, Rain did not know when, the water, which had been clear and transparent before, had turned entirely red, like a lake of blood. Some of it was because of the blood flowing from the shore where the Song army was fighting, but most of it, she had no idea where it had come from. Something flashed in the distance, and a few moments later, the echo of a terrifying roar reached them from afar. The ground quaked, and the lake of blood surged, a tall wave crashing into the low shore. The Queen's daughters were still fighting the great demon. Chapter 1924 Pit of Despair. In the middle of the flooded clearing, Song Sishan was standing in the crimson water, looking at the gargantuan creature in front of her with a twisted smile. Her eyes were shining with an eerie red glow in the dim darkness of the hollows, and her long braid was fluttering in the wind that had risen from the demon's last attack. The Great One was like a mountain, its mighty body covered by bristling black fur. Its body was not quite bestial, but also not quite human. The creature was like an abominable ape, its fangs protruding like cliffs, its eyes burning with diabolical cunning and murderous fury. It was wielding a great club made out of bone, and each time it struck the ground, the entire world quaked. Syard, the beautiful harpy, was playing a deadly game of cat and mouse with the demonic ape by flying around its head, barely dodging its obliterating attacks. Ceres, the enormous three-headed canine, was in an even more precarious position, dancing between the abomination's feet and trying to tear pieces of flesh out of its shins. Either had managed to deliver even a single wound to the great demon yet. However, the demon was bleeding. Opening its maw, the terrifying creature let out a deafening roar and shuddered, forgetting about the annoying fly and the three-headed pest for a moment. Then, it vomited a terrifying waterfall of blood. Blood was flowing from its mouth, from its nose, even from the corners of its eyes, spilling into the shallow water like a red river. That was because Sishan was using her awakened ability. It had taken a while for her ability to take effect, considering how powerful her enemy was. But she wasn't powerless, either. If anything, the most difficult part was limiting the area of effect of her ability to spare her allies from sharing the same fate as the demon. The intoxicating smell of blood was driving her mad, and at the same time making her many times stronger. Standing in the middle of a lake of blood spilled by a great abomination, Sishan was infused with a raging inferno of hungry, furious power. It was the scaling augmentation granted by her ascended ability. It was partially because of that power that she had been able to move with stunning speed to evade the demon's shattering attacks and recover from the terrible wounds littering her body, staying alive despite how vast the gap between her and the guardian of the citadel was. The second reason was her transformation ability. Sishan had possessed the ability to turn into a monster from the time she was a young sleeper, lost in the darkness of the forgotten shore. Therefore, she had not gained the ability to transform into something else when attaining transcendence. Instead, she had gained the ability to transform others. Those she transformed became stronger, and their strength could enhance her own power in turn. And finally, the third reason was the blood of beast god that flowed in her veins, bestowed upon her, whether she had wanted it or not, by her mother, the Raven Queen. And then there was her flaw. Sishan grinned and dashed forward, flying above the red water with stunning speed. The infuriated demon swatted Syard away and kicked Ceres with devastating might, sending the giant canine flying like a tiny pup. Both saints crashed into the shallow water, their bodies bleeding and broken. After that, she was the sole target of the Great One's fury. The enormous bone club crashed into the ground, displacing countless tons of water and making the world shake. Saishin never slowed down, pivoting and then leaping gracefully. Before the displaced water could even start raining down, she already landed on the surface of the club and rushed across its surface, ascending hundreds of meters above the clearing in a heartbeat. Her polished nails turned into terrifying claws, and the red glow of her eyes turned furious and predatory, full of murderous intent. Sadly, she knew that she could not kill the great demon. Maybe if she had time to observe and study the abomination, learning its strengths and weaknesses, gaining a thorough understanding of its powers, and getting insight into the way its perverse mind worked, she would stand a chance. But she was forced to attack it blindly, without making any targeted preparations, so her chances were close to zero. Just the sheer size of the abominations was already an obstacle, not to mention every unholy trait and attribute that thing possessed. Syard and Ceres were severely wounded and would not be joining the fight again, but that was all right. There was a reason why Saishin survived the longest out of anyone who had ever been sent to the Forgotten Shore. That reason was that she knew how to find a way out of the most desperate situation, and then drown her enemies in the pit of despair she had escaped. Right now, for example, there was little chance of defeating the great demon. Therefore, there was no reason to try. Instead, her goal was simply to draw its attention, which she had already done, and stall it for a while. After all, they had not come here to slay a great demon. They had come here to conquer a citadel. And while Saishin was dancing with death by enduring the wrath of the dreadful abomination, her sister Hel was sneaking into the citadel to claim its gateway. The great demon raised its club, lifting Saishin ever higher above the surface of the water. For a moment she was level with its enormous head, and saw the waterfalls of blood flowing from its maw and nostrils. She shivered, feeling her flaw call upon her from somewhere deep, deep within. Saishin licked her alluring red lips. I want to taste it. Asterisk. Advance! The battered 7th Legion rushed forward once again. The retreating soldiers stumbled between them, bleeding and barely staying upright. Their pale faces and sunken eyes were full of numb terror. Reaching the front line, Rain saw a carpet of corpses covering the ground everywhere she looked. Most belonged to hideous nightmare creatures, but many were those of humans, some sickeningly mangled, some strangely intact. There were so many dead that the ancient jungle seemed unable to swallow them all, its profane hunger satiated for the first time in eons. Curse it all! The Somme army was still holding fast, but its breaking point was drawing close. Once they reached it and the battle line collapsed, an even more harrowing slaughter would take place, and all of them would be devoured by the rampaging of nightmare creatures. Stay alive! Forward together! For the Queen! Tamar's shout brought her back to her senses. Gripping the hilt of her black tachi, Rain gritted her teeth and braced herself. A moment later, the nightmare creatures were upon them. Hopeless. It is hopeless, no matter how much they fought, no matter how much they killed, no matter how much they died, the flood of abominations would not end, and these nightmare creatures were the lesser evil, at that. Even if the expedition force somehow managed to eradicate them all, the true horrors of the Hollows would soon arrive. Attracted by the overwhelming smell of blood, Rain felt the chilling shiver run down her spine when she realized that she could, indeed, die here today. Her sweat turned cold, and she drew in a shaky breath. And then, something imperceptible changed about the world. It was as if the sweltering heat of God Rave receded a little, and a cool breeze gently caressed her skin. Rain was not just imagining it either. She could see her fellow soldiers react to the strange change, too. Even the nightmare creatures were affected. Their ceaseless onslaught turned slower, for a moment, and then lulled. What? Confused and struggling to believe what she was seeing, Rain stared at the abominations. The abominations had actually stopped, and were now sniffing the air, growling, and it almost seemed as though some of them were cowering in fear, Far behind her, in the middle of the flooded clearing, the gargantuan great demon noiselessly fell down, and, at the same time, Rain froze in terror. The countless corpses littering the vast swath of the jungle all moved at the same time. The dead nightmare creatures, the fallen humans, they all stirred, moved, and then slowly rose from the ground. Far behind her, the slain great demon was rising from the bloody water, as well, its dead eyes staring forward with no emotion. Rain took a step back, her face turning even paler than usual. The queen. A moment later, the legion of the dead came alive, tearing into the nightmare horde. Soon after that, the battle was over. The Queen of Worms had finally arrived to Godgrave. Chapter 1925 Missing Oracle. Far away, Sunny, his original body, donning the guise of the charming Master Sunless, was sitting on the edge of the ivory island with a resigned smile on his face, suffering in silence. Damn nation. It's torture. His nose was itching. It had been itching for what felt like an eternity already, but sadly, he could not scratch it. He could not move at all, really, because the cloud veil was torn above the war camp of the Song army, drowning the world in a blinding white light. The camp stretched below him, resembling a city. There was no movement on the orderly avenues, and the countless people populating it had all turned into motionless statues. Their silhouettes were like black shadows painted on the blurry white backdrop, melting in the stark radiance. Mercifully, that was simply because his eyes were tearing up, not because they were turning to ash. Now that Saint Tyrus had left to accompany the expedition force on its quest to conquer the citadel, the main camp of the Sword Army had lost her protection. That was why everyone had been forced to learn how to survive the annihilating gaze of the incandescent abyss. Now, several weeks later, people rarely died when the clouds parted. Of course, there were measures in place to alert them of the imminent danger in advance. Sunny was not entirely sure how that was achieved, but there were countless talents in the sword domain, both mundane and awakened. He did not doubt that someone would have come up with a method to predict the movement of clouds. Granted, the warnings rarely came more than a minute before the cloud break, so the method clearly still required some improvement. This time, the clouds parted while Sunny was searching for Cassie, leaving him no choice but to sit down and patiently wait for the danger to pass. It had been close to an hour since then, and the grave veil was finally starting to show signs of repairing itself. 10 minutes later, the blinding radiance finally subsided, and Sunny furiously scratched his nose. Ah, damn it! He wondered if anyone in Godgrave had died from sneezing yet, then rose to his feet and looked around. Sunny had already checked everywhere on the Ivory Island, including the underground level of the Ivory Tower and Cassie's personal quarters. He had checked every cabin of the Chain Breaker, as well, and asked around among the firekeepers. No one had seen the Blind Seer, which could only mean one thing: that she was performing her duties as the seneschal of the great clan Valor somewhere in the camp. Unless something out of the ordinary had happened. Frowning, he walked over to one of the 7 chains anchoring the Ivory Island to the ground and descended by walking across it. Sunny was reluctant to unleash his shadow sense here, so his best choice was to go check personally. Fortunately, Valor Keep, the stone stronghold that served as the headquarters of the Sword Army and the residence of the king, was not far. He reached it in a matter of minutes and hesitated at the entrance, feeling uncomfortable under the dubious gazes of the guards. The thing was, Sunny had only ever entered the keep while accompanying either Nephis or Cassie. He had never been here alone, and wasn't sure if he was even allowed inside. Clearing his throat, he hesitated for a moment, cringed inwardly, and addressed the guards in a commanding tone. "I am Sir Sunless, Knight Commander of the Ardent Wardens. Move aside." Gods, I actually said it. The guards stared at him some more. Eventually, one of them sneered. "Oh, yes. We know precisely who you are, Sir Sunless." The derision in his voice was not even hidden, but the guards did move aside. Sunny glowered at them for a moment, then walked into the gate. Halfway across the threshold, however, he halted, backed a few steps, and looked at the rude guard for a moment. Then, a pleasant smile appeared on his face. Do you, perhaps, want to challenge me to a duel? The guard paled a little, shivered, and slowly shook his head. And no. Knight Sunless, sir. Sunny's smile brightened menacingly. Thought so. With that, he entered the stronghold without looking back. Nephice was gone from the camp, as well, so people were getting braver as far as showing him their contempt was concerned. Sunny did not really mind, but it was starting to get tiresome. Perhaps it was time to teach them another lesson in humility, but not now. Sighing, Sunny found the nearest person wearing the colors of Clan Valor and inquired if Song of the Fallen was nearby. He had not really expected a positive answer, but to his surprise, the man simply nodded and gave him directions to a certain chamber in the depths of the keep. The chamber was guarded by several knights, which gave him pause. Although nothing showed on his face, Sunny felt his whole body tense up for a moment, and his heart started to race. Were these ascended guards sent to protect Cassie as a sign of how highly she was valued by Clan Valor? Or were they here to make sure that she couldn't escape? Was there a sorceress cage inside the chamber that cut off her powers, similar to the one in which the two of them had spent an unforgettable time in the Night Temple? This was the burden of being a double agent for a regicidal insurgency. Sunny never knew if he was one heartbeat away from having his treasonous ways revealed. He lingered for a moment, then asked with decorum, Is Saint Cassia inside? One of the knights looked down at him sternly, then nodded and turned around to knock on the door politely. You have a visitor, my lady. Hearing Cassie's response, he opened the door and let Sunny inside. The chamber was sparsely furnished, but quite comfortable. There was a soft sofa, several armchairs, a wooden table with succulent fruit and refreshments, and even a memory keeping the air cool, not to mention a few bottles of beverages from the waking world. Vermilion curtains moved slightly in the wind, and sunlight was pouring through a narrow window. Cassie was half sitting, half laying on the sofa, her beautiful face showing signs of extreme fatigue. One of the hands was lowered powerlessly, while the other was holding a silver goblet. Sunny was worried for a moment, then determined that there were no wounds on her body and let out a sigh of relief. The blind seer, meanwhile, turned her head in his direction. Who is it? He frowned out. Shouldn't she know already? Then again, their mental link seemed to be inactive, which meant that Cassie's ascended ability was suppressed for some reason. If the same was true for her awakened ability, which allowed her to sense what would happen a few seconds in the future, then she would be truly and utterly blind. Sunny's frown deepened. It's me, Saint Cassia. Master Sunless. He threw a glance at her ascended guards and unceremoniously closed the door. That would not prevent them from eavesdropping on their conversation, but it was better than nothing. A pale smile illuminated Cassie's face. Sunny, it's good that you're here. I was just thinking about asking someone to escort me back to the Ivory Island. Sunny took a deep breath, considered his thoughts for a moment, and then asked bluntly, What happened to you? He thought that he already knew the answer. In hindsight, it was quite obvious. Cassie sighed, then dropped her head on the soft armrest of the sofa. Her voice was a little tired. Essence exhaustion.